Most of us prefer to tie up loose ends in our lives, but doing so often means untangling things first. Reconciliation demands reckoning. To forgive, we must pardon the wrong, as we see in Joseph's story. When Jacob died, the brothers were afraid that Joseph, perfectly positioned for vengeance, might hold a grudge. Joseph had already forgiven them, but they were still afraid of repercussions for having sold him into slavery. They cast themselves before him, pleading that he forgive them again. Joseph reassured them, "Do not fear. What you meant for evil, God meant for good." Joseph's words came from having experienced God's sovereignty firsthand. From the moment he was sold into slavery to his reunion with his brothers and father, Joseph was carried by God's mercy and provision. God used every individual, Joseph's brothers, the chief cupbearer, even Pharaoh himself, in his plan. Not only to preserve Joseph's family from famine, but also to secure future generations of Israel and the covenant he made with Joseph's forefathers. From jealousy and rage, God wrote a story of forgiveness and reconciliation. Come with us as we see Joseph give God the glory for taking what was planned for evil and turning it into good.
Jacob blesses Ephraim and Manasseh. This is Genesis 48. So after this that means we're about 17 years later. Jacob meets Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asks him how old he is, and he says he's 130. But now Jacob is getting ready to die here, so he dies at 147, so this is 17 years later. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. They're listed in order here of the oldest and the youngest. Manasseh is the oldest. And Jacob and his sons are living in Goshen, and Joseph is living in Avaris, the capital. So he's got to travel a few miles to get to his father. Maybe 30 miles or so, something like that. So he makes the trip here. And when he gets there, Jacob is told, "Your son Joseph has come to see you." So Israel summoned his strength, and he sat up in bed. He was lying down, so he sits up now. And Jacob says to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me." The account of this is found in Genesis 35, 9 through 15. And this is where God blesses Jacob, and he changes his name from Jacob to Israel, and then Jacob renames the place from Luz to Bethel. And he said to me, "Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and give you this land to your offspring, and after you an everlasting possession." So God is essentially repeating the same promise he had earlier made to Abraham and to Jacob's father, Isaac. Now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Can you imagine the surprise on Joseph's face here when Jacob is telling him that your two sons are mine? Imagine visiting your parents and they tell you, "Well, your children are mine." Imagine you're surprised. You might say, "Well, okay, then you can pay for their college." So Ephraim, now he says, "Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are." Earlier we saw that it was listed Manasseh and Ephraim. Now it's Ephraim, Manasseh. So this is signaling to us that a change is going to come. Ephraim is going to have preeminence over Manasseh. "And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours." There's no record of Joseph having any more children. "They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance." So Jacob is saying, Ephraim and Manasseh are going to share the inheritance with his other sons. But if you have any more sons, then their inheritance is going to come from Ephraim and Manasseh. They will not be equal with the rest of Jacob's sons. "As for me, when I came from Padan," that's where Laban lived, "to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way. when there was still some distance to go to Bethlehem. Now this isn't any news to Joseph because he was still with him at that time. So Jacob adopts Joseph's sons. Joseph dedicated 17 years to caring for his elderly father and restoring the affection that they previously had enjoyed. When that period came to an end, Joseph's actions in Genesis 48 and 50 show the depth of his grief. As was customary in the ancient world, fathers imparted blessings to their children and to their grandchildren before dying, and Jacob welcomed this role. He began by restating God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants and the promise of a divine inheritance in the land of Israel. Then he formally adopted Joseph's sons, taking them as his own, giving the younger son the blessing of the older son. This role reversal echoes the blessings of Jacob and Esau in Genesis 27. It also parallels Jacob's favoritism of Joseph over his older brothers. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, when he comes to them, he said, "Who are these?" Which sounds kind of puzzling. Why would he say, "Who are these?" Well, we see later on here that Israel's eyes were dim. So he had that same problem that Isaac had, where he could not see. And keep in mind here also that these sons now are in their early 20s, because 17 years have come since Jacob came into the land, and then Ephraim and Manasseh were already young boys at that time. So he says, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim because with age. So Joseph brought them near to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel says to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Notice here that previously Israel, Jacob goes back and forth, but when Jacob is doing blessings, he tends to be called by the name of Israel, the sons of Israel. So Joseph removed them from his knees, or from between their knees. You can hardly imagine a 147-year-old man about to die having two 20-year-old grandsons sitting on his knees. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near to him. Joseph knows that Jacob's going to bless them, so he places him in a position where his right hand is going to be on the older, his left hand is going to be on the younger. But Jacob doesn't go for this. So Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and the left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph through his sons, and he says, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the God who," whoa, it's not the God, you're expecting the God, but no, we have the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name Israel, be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Well, who is this angel, and why is he sort of in a position where he's equated with God? Well, the angel, as it turns out, is the angel of Yahweh, and it's believed that this angel is a theophany, or Christophany, in the Old Testament. So when he speaks, he is speaking as God. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused, and he said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." This seems to be a repetition of what has happened earlier. This is like the fourth time where we see Isaac take the preeminence over Ishmael, Jacob takes preeminence over Esau, Joseph takes preeminence over Reuben, and Ephraim takes preeminence over Manasseh. And here where Joseph gets a little upset because of this, reminds you a little bit of when Abraham is asked to move to take Ishmael and take him away, and he loved him, but God reassured him. He says, don't worry, I'm going to make a nation out of Ishmael also. I'll make a people out of him also, but Isaac is the one through whom the promises come. Here's the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. This comes from 1 Chronicles 4. He was the firstborn because he defiled his father's couch. His birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. Though Judah became strong among his brothers and the chief came from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph, or to Joseph's son. And you remember, with the birthright comes a double portion. So Joseph gets this double portion, essentially, that his two sons each get a full portion, thereby giving Joseph a double portion. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. So God bless you as those two sons. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Again, take you back to Canaan's land. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. And that land is by Shechem, and that is the land in Shechem. That is where they will take and bury Joseph when Moses and the children of Israel come out of Egypt. So chapter 49, Jacob blesses his sons. Jacob blesses his sons. Some of these don't sound like blessings. So some of the other Bible versions replace that with Israel's prophecy concerning his sons. New American Standard. New Living Translation has Jacob's last words to his sons. So he calls his sons together, all 12 of his sons there. He's there in his bed. And gather yourselves together around me, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come. So that does sort of sound like a prophecy rather than a blessing. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father. So gather together so that I can tell you what will happen. By the end of chapter 47 of Genesis, all the major conflicts in the story of Joseph have been resolved. The famine is now over. Joseph has been reunited with his brothers as well as with his father. Jacob has given Joseph final instructions on how to bury him in his homeland in Canaan. Joseph's story, however, is part of a larger story in the Bible, the story of Abraham's descendants and of God's plan to redeem the entire world through Abraham. Genesis 48 through 50 provides the conclusion to the life of Jacob and his 12 sons. Just as Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau, Jacob now blesses Ephraim over Manasseh. Jacob's final words to each of his sons summarizes their past actions. We'll see that especially with Reuben and Levi and Simeon, and points to the future of the nation of Israel.
Good thought.
Somebody got a comment? Okay. Starts out with Reuben. Reuben is the oldest. Reuben, you're my firstborn, my might, and the first fruits of my strength. Preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. It sounds pretty good for Reuben. He's probably thinking, okay, this is going pretty well. But now, unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. It looks like he's talking to Reuben here. Then it looks like he turns toward the rest of his sons and he says, he went up to my couch. How dare he? This is found from Genesis 35:22. It explains this when Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Simeon and Levi are next. They're the sons number 2 and 3. And this is the only blessing where two of them are grouped together. And he says, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Well, of course they are. They're all brothers here, but probably more to the point here, Simeon and Levi are two of a kind, two peas in a pod, brothers in crime. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. Rather than a blessing, cursed be their anger, for it is fierce than their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That does come true when they do the inheritance in the land of Israel, because the Levites do not get a territory of their own, but they get cities within the territories of their brothers and the pasture land around them. So the Levites are scattered. Simeon's inheritance is right in the midst of Judah, surrounded by Judah. And by the time of David and Solomon, Simeon has pretty much been absorbed into the tribe of Judah. Now Judah gets the second longest blessing here. Joseph gets the longest. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Doesn't this remind you a little bit of Joseph here, where he has that dream about his Jacob's sons bowing down before him? Now the blessing for Judah is that Jacob's sons are now going to bow down to him. Judah's a lion's cub, for the prey, my son, you have gone up. He swooped down, he crouched as a lion. A lion, that's symbols of royalty here, symbols of power. Scepter, ruler's staff, obedience of the people. Sounds like a ruler is going to come out of Judah. Definitely have the language for that here. Binding his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt. We think of Jesus here, the triumphant entry on the colt of a donkey. The choice vine. I am the vine, you are the branches. We see a lot of similarity here to the coming Messiah here in Judah's blessing. So, Judah to David to Jesus. Judah's going to be the kingly tribe. After blessing Joseph's sons, Jacob blessed Joseph and gave him a greater portion than the rest of his brothers. After meeting with Joseph and his sons privately, Jacob called all of his sons to himself, but not all of them would receive his blessing. The first three sons, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, incurred harsh rebukes and curses. Judah, next after Levi, was given the right to rule within the family with the promise that a king would come from his tribe. The other brothers received blessings that reflected their destiny in Israel's history, but Joseph was given an extra benediction. In the first part of Joseph's blessing, Jacob recognizes his success in the face of hostility. Throughout his life, Joseph had been attacked by opponents, particularly his brothers and Potiphar's wife. But sustained by God, he overcame all these obstacles. As the blessing continued, Jacob shifted to Joseph's future. Jacob affirmed his confidence in God's continued assistance in Joseph's life, because he will remain in this position until he's 110 years old, noting that it would be characterized by provision, abundance, and fertility. We studied earlier that in the book of Genesis, when God blesses people, he blesses them in two ways: the ability to produce wealth and the ability to produce offspring. Among the many benefits that arose from Joseph's trials, Jacob's blessing of Judah ranks near the top. On his deathbed in Egypt, Jacob spoke honestly and prophetically about his sons. His words to Judah have a tremendous bearing on the most important redemption story in history, the coming of the Messiah. Jacob described Judah's future as a leader among his brothers. He granted Judah a position of authority among his descendants. Centuries later, when Israel settled the Promised Land, the nation asks for a ruler to lead them in battle. After Saul, who came from the tribe of Benjamin, failed as a king, God raised David, a descendant of Judah, to lead the nation. God later made a covenant with David and promised to establish his throne forever. This promise pointed to the Messiah, the Savior and deliverer of Israel, a descendant of David and Judah. Now, even though Joseph was the favored son and he had the great blessing here, it's actually not Joseph that the kingly tribe would come from, but Psalm 78 tells us that God, rejects the tent of Joseph. He doesn't choose the tribe of Ephraim, the favored tribe, but instead he chooses the tribe of Judah. And Mount Zion, which will be in the territory of Judah, which he loves. He chooses David, his servant, from the tribe of Judah. He takes him from being leader of the sheepfolds, a shepherd of the sheep, to being a shepherd of Jacob, his people, and a shepherd of Israel. Next to Zebulun and Issachar, these are short. Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. Zebulun's territory is along the Sea of Galilee. Issachar is a strong donkey crouching between sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor. Dan, of course we know Dan shall judge his people. Samson, the judge, came from Dan. So there's the reference there about judge. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels. I wait for your salvation. Of all the tribes, Dan seemed to have the hardest time of conquering his territory. He wasn't able to conquer the territory to which he'd been allotted. Eventually they move up north, and in the book of Judges, they're sort of condemned for attacking a peaceful, defenseless people in a small town and taking their town, because that's the only people they could conquer, was a defenseless people. Raiders shall raid Gad. Asher's food shall be rich. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. So Gad, Asher, and Naphtali, they've got short but good blessings upon them. Okay, Joseph, he gets the longest blessing here. A fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over a wall. The archers bitterly attack him, shoot at him, harass him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. But you see here, verses 25 through 26 here, you see a common theme here. It is a blessing. Blessing appears here, 6 times. Joseph's going to receive the blessing from the Almighty, as well as the blessing from his father. So a lot of blessing here for the tribe of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, his sons. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, in the evening dividing the spoil. This seems kind of strange for Benjamin to get this blessing. Benjamin, after Joseph was gone, Benjamin became the favorite son here. But Benjamin, a ravenous wolf. Of course, we know the first king, Saul, came from Benjamin. Saul of Tarsus, later Paul, came from Benjamin, who's a ravenous wolf. But if you remember the book of Judges we studied a few years ago, Benjamin, all of Israel joined together and fought against Benjamin and almost wiped them out. Benjamin had that one city, a Levite and his concubine came into the city of Benjamin, and they essentially raped his concubine, and he cut her apart and sent her throughout Israel, and all of Israel went to war against Benjamin, leaving only about 600. Jacob's death and burial. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to each of them, as he blessing each one of them with a blessing suitable to him. And then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burial place. So that's a mouthful talking about the cave that he purchased. Abraham was given a promise of all that land, yet it wasn't until Sarah died at the age of 127, he was 137, this was the first time that Abraham had actually owned any land, had the legal deed to any land in the land of Canaan. And it was because he purchased a field, he needed a burial place to bury his wife. And this would be where all his descendants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would be buried. There they buried Abraham and Sarah, his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And there I buried Leah. We don't have any record of his burying Leah. We do of him burying the other wife. I cannot think of her name. Rachel. He buried her there near Bethlehem. This is the only record we have of Leah being buried. So she is actually buried in the family tomb. Rachel is buried by herself there near Bethlehem. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So this is the end of Jacob now. His burial and Joseph's death. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So rather than the priests, he asked that the physicians embalm his father. Because this is generally done by the priests because they are preparing the body for the afterlife, the Egyptian philosophy of what the afterlife was. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. So a total of 110 days were devoted to Jacob after his death. Mummification. It was not practiced by the Hebrews. The Hebrews did not do that. And so Joseph entrusts the task to Egyptian physicians rather than the priests. But it was normally done by the priests, but Joseph may have deliberately chosen to use physicians in order to distinguish his father's beliefs from those of the Egyptian priests. Apart from Jacob, the only other person in the Bible who was embalmed is Joseph. So only Joseph. They did not embalm Jesus. They just wrapped his body, put spices around him. Embalming, that's where you actually cut up the body and take out the organs and stuff it with spices and stuff like to preserve the body. They wanted to preserve the body as much as possible for the afterlife. But Jesus taught that the afterlife is spiritual, so there would be no need to preserve the body. Here's the lid of a sarcophagus. After his final words to his sons, Jacob asked to be buried at his family gravesite at Machpelah, which Abraham purchased in Genesis 23. When Jacob died, Joseph grieved more visibly than his other brothers. He ordered that Jacob be embalmed according to Egyptian custom, and he led a massive funerary procession to Machpelah to bury his father. Grief wasn't the only emotion Jacob's death ignited. With their father's passing, Joseph's brothers began to fear once again that Joseph would take vengeance for their evil past. Jacob had been a restraining force. Joseph loved his father too much to bring him more heartache, however. But now, with Jacob gone, the brothers worried that Joseph would no longer be concerned with his father and now take vengeance upon him for what they had done to him. When the days of weeping for him were past, that is 110 days now, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die. In I'm about to die, in my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So I found this kind of unusual. Joseph, being second in command, pretty much had easy access to Pharaoh. So why does he go through Pharaoh's household to ask for permission to go? Makes me wonder, is this the same Pharaoh? 17 years have passed. Maybe the other Pharaoh has died and this is a different Pharaoh. I don't know. It just seems unusual that Joseph wouldn't have gone himself. Maybe this was during the time when he was in grieving and he didn't want to go to Pharaoh. Whatever, but anyway, he goes through Pharaoh's household rather than asking directly. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with them both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company that went. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. So in addition to those 110 days, we've got 7 more days of mourning, plus the time it took to get there. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. Seems like the author here really wants to emphasize that. I think this is the third time this has been mentioned. After he'd buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So this great company that went to bury now is returning to Egypt. So here, this is a slide I showed when we were studying Abraham. This is what that cave of Machpelah looks like today. Of course, they built this large monument over it. And this is the second holiest site for the Jews, second only to the temple. And this is the fourth holiest site to Muslims. Of course, because the Muslims also revere Abraham as the father of Ishmael. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. They're a little bit concerned here. Now Joseph has forgiven them, but there's those self-doubts now that our father's gone. Maybe he wasn't telling us the truth. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. Now, this is kind of interesting because we have nowhere mentioned, it was probably done so, but we have nowhere mentioned where Jacob actually had heard that it was the brothers who had sold him there. They probably wouldn't have admitted it. Did Joseph tell them that this had happened? But apparently they feel that their father knew that they had done this evil, and now they want to make sure that Joseph doesn't take revenge. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him, because there was no mention of Jacob in the blessings of the brother. He mentions all the things they went wrong. He mentions Reuben with Bilhah. He mentions what Levi and Simeon did, but he doesn't mention anything about the brothers selling Joseph. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." We have a repetition of this. This is what Joseph told his brothers when he revealed himself to them when they came to buy grain. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. God meant it for good. The brothers approached Joseph with a plea. They claimed that before their father died, he asked Joseph to pardon their sin. The Bible doesn't record whether such an exchange ever took place between Jacob and his sons. In light of their fear and guilt, their story seems a bit contrived. Awash in worry, they likely forget that Joseph had already pardoned them and expressed his confidence in God's sovereignty. Joseph defied their expectations. Weeping, he reassured them that he had no harmful intentions against them, and he confidently asserted his understanding of the family's turbulent history and God's sovereign design. As for you, you planned evil against me, but God planned it for good in order to do this, to keep many people alive, as it is today. Genesis 15, verse 20. With these words, Joseph calmed the fears and acknowledged his life's purpose. Joseph's brothers were crippled by guilt. Their inability to accept his forgiveness resonates with many Christians. Like Joseph's brothers, we've been offered extraordinary forgiveness, but we often fail to let it permeate our lives. Instead of accepting God's unrestricted forgiveness in Christ, we may try to secure forgiveness for ourselves rather than depend on the only source of hope and peace, the death and resurrection of Christ. Christians celebrate the Lord's Supper to remember what Christ has accomplished on our behalf. According to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus presented the cup to his disciples during his final meal and spoke the following words: "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Matthew 26:28. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he told them to celebrate the meal as a way of proclaiming the Lord's death. Paul knew that by recalling the significance of the work of Christ, the Corinthians would grow to trust God's saving grace more and more. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. Now this doesn't seem long compared to his forefathers. Abraham, 175 years. Isaac, 180 years. Jacob, 147 years. But 110 years was considered the ideal life for an Egyptian at this time. Remember that Joseph pretty much grew up as an Egyptian. Many Egyptians only lived to be about 40 or 50, so 110 was a good age at this time. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." It does seem a little funny, though, that Joseph is the youngest, other than Benjamin. He's much younger than the rest of his brothers, and that he is dying before they are. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So at 110 years old, Joseph dies. He's embalmed. That's 40 years again, and then there would be the 70 years of mourning. If they do not take him and bury him, he will remain in Egypt until the time of the Exodus. And then they take him, and then his bones of him are taken, and he is buried in Shechem after they have crossed the Jordan back into the promised land. The word there, God will surely visit you. That does not mean there's going to be a theophany or Christophany, but when God visits his people, that means that he's going to come, he's going to take care of them, he's going to do something good for them. Like when God visited a barren woman, then she was able to conceive and have a child. Okay, this is our last slide here. Looks like we got through this, so you'll be able to take off. And those of you who are heading to the church building, interesting fact here, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we read about them, and all three of them built altars to God in the land of Canaan.
Yep.
However, there's no record anywhere of Jacob or any of his sons, any of his descendants, ever building an altar to God in the land of Goshen. So you hope that they kind of remain in their faith. They do not have the Canaanites or any of them to deal with, but hopefully they do remain faithful to the Lord. But we know what during the time of the Exodus, they remembered the golden calf, and they do build a golden calf there. So any comments?
Enjoyed it, Warner.
Got about 2 minutes left. All right, so that's it. Signing off here. So this is it. So the next 4 lessons will be on the latter reign of King David. These lessons, the Abraham, the Jacob, the Joseph, none of them were 13 lessons, so we fill them in. Abraham, that was filled in with John Hamilton doing the lesson on Ruth. We did Jacob, that was filled in with Gordon doing the lesson on Jonah, and then this one will be filled out with the latter part of the reign of King David. So that's it.
Thank you, Warner.
You are welcome. I'm going to stop sharing here.
For